America's most decorated soldier of World War II, Audie Murphy, used to refer modestly to himself as a fugitive from the law of averages.
He was the most decorated American soldier of World War II. He killed over 240 men, held off an entire German company by himself, and came home to a ticker tape parade. Then, Hollywood turned him into a movie star. But behind the medals and the fame, Audie Murphy was falling apart. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow. He beat a man nearly to death in a motel room. He went bankrupt. He fought the government, fought his own mind, and fought anyone who got too close. And before he died, he finally told the truth about the first man he ever killed. The boy no one believed in. To understand the confession Audie Murphy made near the end of his life, you have to go back to where he started, because nothing about this story was ever supposed to turn out the way it did. Audie Leon Murphy was born on June 20, 1924, in a small farming community near Kingston, Texas, the sixth of 12 children. His father, Emmett Barry Murphy, was a sharecropper, a man who worked land owned by someone else and barely kept enough of the harvest to feed his family. There was no running water in the house. Some winters, there wasn't enough food. Audie learned to hunt squirrels and rabbits as a child, not for sport, but because the family needed meat to survive. He became a precise, patient marksman before he was a teenager, and he didn't even know it was unusual. His father, Emmett, was not a steady man. He drank and disappeared for stretches at a time. In 1940, when Audie was 16, Emmett walked out on the family entirely and never came back. No explanation, no letter. Just gone. That abandonment left a wound that Murphy carried for the rest of his life, and that would show up again and again in the way he related to authority figures, to people who claimed to be on his side, and to the concept of loyalty itself. Then, 1 year later, came the death. In June 1941, Josie Bell Murphy, Audie's mother, the center around which the whole fragile household had turned, died of a heart condition at 52. Audie was 17 years old, effectively orphaned, with younger siblings being distributed to relatives and orphanages across East Texas. He was, in every practical sense, alone. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Murphy walked into a recruiting office within days. He was going to war. The Marines turned him away. Too short at 5 feet 5 inches, too light at 112 pounds. The Navy said no. The paratroopers said no. It was the regular Army infantry that finally took him in June 1942, when Murphy was barely 18. He had told them he was 18. He was 17. Almost every officer who saw him in those early weeks thought he was a liability. His face was so young, so round-cheeked and freckled, that he became the butt of jokes across the base. Commanding officers tried repeatedly to redirect him to cook, clerk, supply runner, anything to keep this baby-faced kid out of actual combat. Murphy fought every reassignment. He appealed, complained, made himself impossible to ignore, and eventually wore them down. He was assigned to the 3rd Infantry Division, 15th Infantry Regiment, a unit that would go on to see more continuous combat than nearly any other American division in the entire war. He shipped to North Africa in early 1943, then Sicily, then the Italian mainland, then southern France, the Vosges Mountains, and the Rhine. The boy who had hunted squirrels in Texas to feed his family was now moving through one of the most relentless military campaigns in the history of the United States Army. And the marksmanship, the patience, the cold-blooded calm he had developed in the fields of East Texas turned out to be exactly what the infantry needed. But first, Sicily, July 1943. At a moment near a small town called Canicotti that Murphy would spend the rest of his life thinking about. The official story of Audie Murphy is a story of glory. His Medal of Honor, his 33 decorations, his Life magazine cover. The movie they made about him broke box office records. That story is true, but it is not the whole truth. The whole truth started in Sicily in the summer heat, with 2 men on horseback and a 19-year-old boy who made a decision he could never fully justify to himself, no matter how many years passed. The army gave Murphy a medal for what he became. What Murphy confessed before the end was what it cost him to become it. The first kill, the medal, and the truth he buried. It was July 1943 in the hills of central Sicily, and Audie Murphy was in combat for the first time. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, had begun on July 9th and 10th, with the largest amphibious landing in military history to that point, involving nearly 180,000 troops from the US, British, and Canadian forces. Murphy's unit landed on the southern coast and began pushing north through brutal summer heat, through vineyards and stone farmhouses and narrow roads lined with olive trees. The Italian and German forces were retreating, but they were fighting as they went. Near the town of Canicattì, Murphy encountered 2 Italian cavalry officers on horseback. In his memoir, To Hell and Back, published in 1949, he described seeing them come into view and making the decision almost before he was fully conscious of making it. He fired. Both men went down. In the memoir, written 4 years after the war, while the memories were still raw, Murphy described feeling almost nothing in the immediate aftermath, a kind of blankness. He noted it with confusion. He had expected to feel something dramatic, either pride or guilt, and instead there was just the silence after the shots and the horses running loose, and the ordinary business of continuing to move forward. What Murphy said later in conversations with his biographer, in interviews given in the late 1960s, and in the Washingtonian magazine interview in early 1971 that is now considered one of the most important first-hand documents on combat trauma ever recorded, was that the blankness was not peace. It was the first layer of something that would keep building for decades. He said he was never entirely certain those men had needed to die. They may have been fleeing, they may have been surrendering. He had acted on a split-second assessment driven by fear as much as by training. And in the chaos of his first combat engagement, he had not waited long enough to be sure. He had been taught that hesitation got you killed. He had not hesitated. But hesitation, he came to believe, might also have been mercy. He would never know. The first one is the one that stays, he told a reporter in 1970. After that, something changes. You don't feel the same way twice. The action that put his name in the history books came a year and a half later, on January 26, 1945, near the village of Holtzwihr in the Alsace region of France. Murphy's company had been ground down to just 19 men, facing 2 full German companies, roughly 250 soldiers backed by 6 Tiger tanks. Murphy ordered his men into the tree line. He stayed behind alone. What he did next lasted almost an hour. He climbed onto a burning M10 tank destroyer, a vehicle whose fuel and ammunition could detonate at any moment, and operated its .50 caliber machine gun. He fired into the advancing Germans while simultaneously calling in artillery coordinates over a field telephone. He was wounded in the leg. He kept firing. When he finally ran out of ammunition, he walked back to his men, refused medical evacuation, and led a counterattack that drove the Germans back. His Medal of Honor citation credited him with killing or wounding approximately 50 enemy soldiers in that single engagement. He received every major decoration the United States could award, plus medals from France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. When the final count was made, Murphy had been officially credited with 240 enemy kills across the entire campaign, a number historians believe understates the reality. He was 20 years old when the war in Europe ended in May 1945. He came home to Life magazine covers, victory parades, and a White House invitation. America needed heroes, and Murphy was the perfect one. Young, handsome, from nothing, self-made in the most extreme way imaginable. The story wrote itself. But Murphy knew what the story left out. He knew about Canicattì. He knew about the nightmares that started in Italy and never stopped. He knew that the face smiling on the magazine cover was not a face at peace. And for years, Because that was what was expected of him, he kept that knowledge private. It would take 2 decades, a pill addiction, a bankruptcy, a near-murder charge, and the approach of his own death before he said it clearly. The war had broken something in him that no metal could fix. Hollywood, fame, and the cracks beneath the surface. In the summer of 1945, James Cagney, one of the biggest movie stars in the world, saw Audie Murphy's face on the cover of Life magazine and made a decision that would change the trajectory of both of their lives. He picked up the phone, tracked Murphy down, and invited the 21-year-old war hero to come to California and stay with him. Cagney believed Murphy had something the camera would love. He was right. But the relationship between the two men was more complicated than the warm origin story suggests. Murphy moved into Cagney's property, took acting lessons at Cagney's arrangement, and was introduced around Hollywood through Cagney's connections. Murphy was very grateful, and also, by his own account and the accounts of people who knew him well, quietly resentful. He had grown up in a household abandoned by his father, had survived by depending on no one, had fought a war in which self-reliance was the only currency that mattered. Being someone's protege, someone's project, felt perilously close to owing a debt he hadn't chosen to take on. The tension between Murphy and Cagney never became a public feud, but the warmth in their relationship cooled as Murphy became more established. Murphy pulled away. He was, people around him said, constitutionally unable to let himself be comfortable accepting help. He had to be the one who stood alone on the burning tank. That wasn't just a war story, it was his personality. His acting career launched with supporting roles in the late 1940s and built to a starring career at Universal Pictures in the early 1950s. He made westerns mostly a genre that suited his laconic delivery and his genuine comfort with horses and guns. He was not a trained actor in any traditional sense, but he had a naturalness on camera that more formally trained performers sometimes lacked. Directors who liked him called it authenticity. Directors who struggled with him called it stubbornness. The film that made him a genuine cultural phenomenon was To Hell and Back in 1955, Universal's adaptation of his own memoir, in which Murphy played himself. It became Universal's highest-grossing film to that point in the studio's history, a record it held for 20 years, until Jaws in 1975. Murphy was suddenly not just a war hero or a Western star, but a genuine box office draw. Off the set, however, he was extraordinarily difficult to manage. He arrived late, clashed with directors over interpretations, and had a documented tendency to resolve disagreements by escalating them physically. In one widely repeated story, he threatened a studio executive during a contract dispute in a way that made clear the threat was not rhetorical. Multiple people who worked with him during this period described the same pattern: charismatic, warm, and generous one day, hair-trigger, hostile, and impossible the next. The mood swings had a name, though nobody was calling it that yet. What Murphy had was PTSD, severe and untreated. He woke screaming from nightmares. He could not sleep without a loaded weapon within reach. Sudden loud noises could send him into a defensive crouch before he was fully conscious of what had happened. He was hyper-vigilant, paranoid about betrayal, and incapable of the kind of sustained trust that stable relationships require. His first marriage was to actress Wanda Hendricks, whom he married in February 1949. It lasted 2 years. Hendricks, in interviews given long after the divorce, described the reality of living with Murphy with quiet candor. She said she was afraid to wake him when he was having nightmares because of the gun under the pillow. She said his moods were unpredictable in a way that made her feel like she was always waiting for something to go wrong. She said he was not a cruel man, but that he was a haunted one, and that the haunting had a physical presence in their home that made ordinary life feel impossible. Murphy did not dispute the substance of her account. He acknowledged that he had been unable to be the person a marriage required. What he was less willing to discuss publicly in that period was why. The why was still a subject he had not fully worked out how to talk about. His second wife, Pamela Archer, married him in 1951 and stayed with him until he died in 1971. They had 2 sons together. The marriage was more stable than the first, partly because Pamela was more prepared for who she was marrying, and partly because Murphy, over the course of the 1950s and early 1960s, began to find language for what was happening inside him. The language was still incomplete, the PTSD was still untreated, but the silence was beginning to crack. Feuds, failures, the fall, and the fight back. By the mid-1960s, Audie Murphy's public image, the war hero turned movie star, had begun to come apart at the seams. What was underneath was not prettier than the image, but it was considerably more honest. In February 1970, Murphy was charged with attempted murder. He had gone to a motel room in North Hollywood to confront a man named Primo Capabianco, a dog trainer who Murphy alleged had been abusing the animals in his care. The confrontation turned violent. Murphy beat Capabianco so badly that the man required hospitalization. Murphy was arrested. The story made national headlines. The charges were eventually dropped in part because Capabianco declined to fully cooperate with prosecutors. But the damage to Murphy's reputation was real and lasting. The image of the smiling, freckle-faced hero was replaced, briefly but vividly, by the image of a middle-aged man who had nearly killed someone in a motel room. Murphy's defense of his own behavior was characteristically unapologetic. Capabianco had been hurting dogs. Murphy had intervened. He didn't apologize for what he had done, only for the legal trouble it had created. People close to Murphy knew the fuller picture. The capacity for extreme violence that the war had installed in him was never far below the surface, and when it came up fast and hard. Throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, Murphy made and lost several fortunes. He invested in Texas oil wells that produced nothing. He put money into California real estate at the wrong moment. He tried horse breeding, a genuine passion, but managed the finances with the same reckless confidence he had brought to an ammunition-depleted machine gun on a burning tank. All in, no retreat, consequences to be dealt with later. He was also a compulsive gambler. He bet on horses, on cards, on anything with odds. People who knew him said the gambling was connected to the same neurological wiring as the combat, the need for adrenaline, for stakes, for the clarity that only comes when something real is at risk. The casinos and the racetracks gave him a version of that. They also took enormous amounts of his money. He was cheated by business partners on more than one occasion and was public about it, naming names in interviews in ways that generated their own minor controversies. In 1968, he filed for personal bankruptcy. The most decorated soldier in American history, the star of Universal's biggest film, was officially broke at 43. The bankruptcy humiliated him. He had spent his entire adult life trying to build security for himself, for his sons, for the extended family he still felt responsible for in Texas. To fail financially was, to Murphy, a particular kind of defeat, the kind that couldn't be answered by climbing onto a burning vehicle and shooting back. Sometime in the early 1960s, Murphy's doctors prescribed Placidil, a brand name for ethchlorovinol, a powerful sedative used for insomnia. Murphy's insomnia was real and severe. He had not slept properly since the war. The nightmares came every night. He would lie in bed waiting for them the way he had once waited for enemy contact in the dark, every muscle tight, every nerve wired. Placidil worked for a while. Then, it stopped working at the prescribed dose. Murphy took more, then more. The addiction built quietly over months and years until he was dependent, and the drug wasn't really helping anymore. It was just holding off the withdrawal. What Murphy did about it became one of the most remarkable chapters of his post-war life. He checked himself into a motel room alone. No doctor, no medical supervision, no support system. He went through cold turkey withdrawal by himself over the course of several days and came out the other side clean. He then went public about it. In a period when admitting addiction was social suicide, especially for a man whose entire public identity was built on toughness, Murphy talked openly about his dependence on prescription sleeping pills. He named the drug. He described the withdrawal. He said it had been the hardest thing he had ever done. He was not asking for sympathy. He was trying to make a point. Treat the PTSD, he said, and you treat the addiction. Leave the PTSD untreated, and the pills and the alcohol and everything else follow as night follows day. In the late 1960s, that argument was radical. The VA did not recognize PTSD as a distinct, treatable condition. Murphy, whose entire value to the military establishment was as a symbol of heroism, was making himself deeply inconvenient. He did not care. He wrote letters to congressmen, he testified, he gave interviews. He said, over and over in plain language, these men are coming home broken and no one is helping them. He was right. It would take another generation before the country caught up. The confession, the crash, and what he left behind. By early 1971, Audie Murphy was moving in a new direction. He had kicked the placidol addiction. He was involved in a real estate development project in California that looked more promising than his previous ventures. He had reconnected with veterans organizations and was planning a new wave of public advocacy for mental health care. People who saw him in January and February of that year described him as more present, more focused, more like himself than he had been in years. He was also talking in a way he had not been able to before. The Washingtonian magazine interview, given in early 1971, is the document most historians and biographers return to when they want to understand who Audie Murphy really was. In it, he described his PTSD with a precision and honesty that was almost clinical. He talked about the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way his body had never come home from the war, even when the rest of him had. He talked about the gun under the pillow and why it was there. He talked about what it felt like to be handed a parade and a medal and told that everything was fine when nothing was fine. And he talked about the first kill, not in the triumphant language of the memoir, not as a moment of decisive combat action. He talked about those two Italian officers on horseback in Sicily in the summer of 1943 as a moment of fear, his fear that had produced an action he spent decades second-guessing. He was not certain, he said, that it had been necessary. He had acted on instinct and training and the adrenaline terror of a teenager in his first firefight. He had told himself for years that it was war, that you didn't have time to think, that you did what you were trained to do. All of that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that he had been afraid, and the fear had fired before the judgment had a chance to engage. He had killed two men who might have been surrendering, and he had worn a hero's face over that fact for the better part of 30 years. This was not a public confession in the legal or dramatic sense. It was not made at a press conference or in a formal statement. It was made in conversation to his biographer, to his wife, to a reporter, to friends who had known him long enough that the performance had worn away. But it was real, and it was deliberate. Murphy was not a man who said things accidentally or who failed to understand the weight of his own words. What he was doing in these final months was finishing a story that America had been allowed to leave unfinished since 1945. The war hero, who had held off 250 Germans by himself, was also a 19-year-old boy who had made a frightened decision in a Sicilian olive grove and never fully forgiven himself for it. Both things were true. Murphy was insisting, at the end of his life, that both things be acknowledged. He died on May 28, 1971. He had boarded a private Aero Commander 680 aircraft in Atlanta, Georgia, bound for Martinsville, Virginia, as part of a group connected to one of his business projects. The pilot, Ronald Dickerson, was not instrument rated, meaning he was not certified to fly in low visibility conditions. The plane flew into heavy fog and a cloud cover near Roanoke, Virginia. At 11:47 in the morning, the aircraft struck the side of Brush Mountain, approximately 40 miles southwest of Roanoke. All 6 people on board were killed instantly. Murphy was 46 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery on June 4, 1971, with full military honors, in a simple grave marked with a standard military headstone, not the elaborate monument that his status might have warranted, because Murphy had specifically requested it. His grave is now the second most visited in all of Arlington, behind only that of President John F. Kennedy. On any given day, there are fresh flowers on it. He left behind Pamela, his wife of 20 years, and their 2 sons, James Shannon and Terrence Michael. He left behind 44 films, 33 medals, and a stack of unanswered letters to the Veterans Administration. He left behind a body of interviews and a memoir that became, over time, far more important as historical documents than anyone intended when they were created. He also left behind the advocacy. His public insistence that combat trauma was real, that veterans deserved mental health treatment, that the silence expected of returning soldiers was a form of cruelty, all of that outlasted him. The frameworks he was demanding did not arrive in any serious form for another decade. But when they did, Murphy's name was part of the argument that had made them possible. The official story of Audie Murphy is a story of glory. It ends with the medals, the life cover, and the Universal Pictures box office record. That story is true, and it is genuinely remarkable. A boy from a Texas sharecrop farm, rejected by every branch of the military for being too small, went on to become the most decorated combat soldier in American history. But Audie Murphy, in the months before the plane went into Brush Mountain, was not interested in telling that story anymore. He was interested in the other one, the one about what it cost and what it broke, and what the country owed the men who had paid that price and come home to nothing but a handshake and a parade. The most decorated soldier in American history died broke and fighting and telling the truth. That part never made it into the movies. Maybe now it should. Audie Murphy spent his whole life being called a hero. But the bravest thing he ever did wasn't on a battlefield. It was telling the truth about what that battlefield did to him. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel and don't forget to press the bell button for more intriguing stories. There are more forgotten truths waiting to be told.